Hello guys, welcome to another session with me, Kola Relation IK, on basically how to build your communication skills. I'm putting out these short snippets on different topics related to communication to help all of us become better communicators. Of course, if you need more specific help, just reach out to me. LinkedIn's my social media platform of choice, or I've got a great free workshop. I'll give you the link at the end of this video. So today I wanted to cover a topic on how to speak with authority. And it's a topic that came to me as I watched the trial of Derek Chauvin, who is the police officer responsible for the death of George Floyd. His trial is currently going on in America. Now, this is not going to be a video where I go into the rights and wrongs of his actions or who's winning or losing the trial. I do have thoughts on it, of course, I am a lawyer, but this isn't that video. This is going to be focused on communication skills, in particular, a specific witness that I was very impressed with when I watched on how he gave his evidence. That is the expert Dr. Martin Tobin. He is an expert pulmonologist. Essentially, he studies physiology and how we breathe in particular. Now, that's very relevant in the the Derek Chauvin trial, of course, because the defense are trying to argue that it wasn't the actions of Derek Chauvin that led to his death, but rather it was because he had drugs in his system, or he had hypertension and an enlarged heart, and somehow, I guess, he was just about to die anyway. Dr. Martin Tobin was brought in by the prosecution essentially to kind of refute those arguments and set out why he says George Floyd actually died. He is one of the world's foremost pulmonologists, and as you'll see through the course of this video, he kind of really knows his stuff. And I thought this was going to be a useful video to help us with the topic that I very often get asked, which is how do we speak with authority? How do we convey a sense of gravitas and authority when we communicate so that others really pay attention? And there are a few things that he does in his expert evidence that I think really bear paying attention to and that we can all learn from. Now, a heads up, there will be parts of this video that deal with pretty sensitive topics relating to the death of George Floyd. I personally had quite a bit of difficulty in doing this video because I've been watching the trial, which has been pretty hard, and also just having to try and relive some of the stuff as we go through the evidence. So I just want to give you that heads up before we launch into the various topics that I'm going to cover in this video on how to speak with authority like Dr. Martin Tobin. Now, the first step to speaking with authority, ironically enough, is to come with your authority, Now, this may sound a little bit strange because there's not really much you can do in the moment when you are communicating to already come with the authority. It's basically about what you bring to the table with you. And I'll show you kind of with Dr. Martin Tobin why that's important. But the reason it's important for us when we're communicating is that a lot of times the extent to which people will listen to you, will buy what you say, depends hugely on the amount of natural authority and credibility you already have on the subject. So one of the first things that you have to do if you know you want to be able to speak with authority is to become an authority in the subject. So make sure you've done your work, your homework, you've built up your resume on the topic. I always encourage people to write a blog, do a YouTube video, post on social media, do an Insta photo, something. It doesn't really matter. But what you're doing is you're building up your stock of authority and credibility so that when you are asked to speak on a topic, you come with that authority with you. And that does a lot of work of helping people to be prepared to listen to what you have to say. Now, Dr. Tobin does this in spades. The prosecution asked him kind of at the beginning of his evidence to explain all the awards that he has won, all the books that he has written, where he's lectured, where he's studied, all his credentials, all of that stuff. And he is clearly a very impressive figure. And in fact, there's one short part of the opening of his evidence when he was asked about an award that he had, what I actually thought really kind of summed up how much of an authority he is in the field of physiology and breathing.
Were you given an award from the Mayo Clinic?
Yes, I was given an award called the Balfour Lecture in the Mayo Clinic, and they give it out to one doctor every 10 years. And it's only to one doctor. It doesn't matter what specialty. So it could be around neurosurgery, gynecology, whatever. They just pick one person every 10 years.
Right. So think about that, right? If you are able to come to the table saying, by the way, I am the one doctor that has been honored every 10 years, that really highlights how much of an expert this witness was. Now, you may not have that, but as I say, you do have the opportunity to really build your credibility with all the work you do before the moment you come to communicate. So that's a little tip from Dr. Tobin. Build your authority so you come to the table with great credibility. That just helps people being prepared to listen to you even before you start speaking. Now, the next element when it comes to speaking with authority is to learn how to signify complexity. Learn how to simplify complexity. Learn how to simplify complexity. One of my favorite quotes by Albert Einstein says, if you cannot explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I think that is a good mantra to kind of have for yourself, because the stamp of expertise and authority isn't being able to impress people with how smart you are by using complicated language and complex kind of terminology that loses them. It's actually the opposite. It's actually being able to take an incredibly complex field, incredibly complex topic, and to distill it and simplify it in a way that everybody can understand. Now, that's particularly important in a jury trial because, of course, you've got 12 members of a jury who are ordinary men and women from the community. They are not pulmonologists or breathing experts or experts in physiology. And so you really have to be able to explain tricky and complex topics that you have been studying for many, many years in a way that they can understand within a few minutes. And this is something that actually Dr. Tobin does incredibly well in a number of instances.
Have you formed an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty on the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I have.
Would you please tell the jury what that opinion or opinions are?
Yes, Mr. Floyd died from a low level of oxygen, and this caused damage to his brain that we see, and it also caused a PEA arrhythmia that caused his heart to stop.
And by PEA, you mean pulseless electrical activity?
Correct. It's a particular form of an abnormal beat of the heart, an arrhythmia, and a particular form of it.
Is this what some persons might refer to as asphyxia?
Yes, it has been called asphyxia. To me, it's not terribly helpful. It just, what we're really talking about is a low level of oxygen. Other people talk about hypoxia. That again is just a Latin term meaning a low level of oxygen. So all of this is just really other words for a phenomenon that is a low level of oxygen.
So do you see how it really sounded very, very straightforward? And in fact, he did it to the extent where when he was asked a question by the prosecuting lawyer about asphyxia and kind of those, those kind of terms, he really basically tries to pull away from that and says, yes, there's Latin terms, hypoxia, asphyxia, but actually all it means is low level of oxygen. Now, low level of oxygen, the jury is going to understand. Hypoxia, asphyxia, they may not without the explanation. So what he's doing is he's setting himself up as a guide for his jury, basically saying, I am going to speak your language. I'm not going to speak the language of experts in Latin. I'm going to speak your language so you can trust what I say, because I'm breaking it down in a way that means I'm focused on your understanding, not just on being an impressive witness. It's really, really good stuff, and he does more of it.
Have you formed an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to what the cause is or was for the low level of oxygen in Mr. Floyd?
Yes, I have.
Would you tell us what that is?
The cause of the low level of oxygen was shallow breathing. Small breaths, small tidal volumes, shallow breaths that weren't able to carry the air through his lungs down to the essential areas of the lungs that get oxygen into the blood and get rid of the carbon dioxide. That's the alveoli at the bottom of the lung.
So, yeah, I found this tough to kind of listen to as we got in, but goodness, how clear is that, right? How straightforward has he boiled down the essence of why George Floyd died? It really, really made it very, very straightforward to understand. And you can imagine the jury being carried along with it, almost with the sense of relief that, oh, thank goodness somebody's just telling us in a way that we can actually get. Now, as the evidence goes on, he does use some diagrams, and I'm going to talk about his use of visuals in a moment. But I just wanted to stick with the simplicity part of things, because another way of basically making sure you're keeping things simple so that it's easily understood is to take something that might look complicated, but to give something that is familiar to help people understand it. And he does this when he's being asked to explain what the hypopharynx is, which is kind of an area in your throat that's your windpipe and where air and things like that goes through. And he uses just a very, very simple approach in order to explain the size or how narrow this passage actually is. Let's watch.
Area of the hypopharynx then is exactly from the base of the epiglottis, the first yellow arrow, down to the second yellow arrow, which is the larynx. And it's just that little area that is the size of the hypopharynx.
Right.
And so we know that the cross-sectional area of the hypopharynx in adult people, I have it here in the millimeters, 199 to 303, which are obviously difficult to remember, those type of millimeters. But in fact, right in the middle of this would be the size of a dime. So a dime is basically the size of what the hypopharynx, and it tells you how small and how vulnerable is this area.
So again, you see, he gave us the specific dimensions, which, as he says as well, is you're never going to remember that. Now, what it's doing is it's giving the audience permission to kind of be at ease, because some of them might be thinking, okay, so I've got to take a note of the dimensions of the hypopharynx. That's going to be relevant later. Oh, that's going to be a bit tricky, but nobody's really going to want to say that or verbalize that. So he makes it easy for people by saying, yeah, you're never going to remember that. So just think about the size of a dime. And by doing that, he instantly makes it understandable for people by giving them something familiar to kind of pitch to, right? So it's the size of 10 cents, I think, is a dime. And so because they all are familiar with that size, they probably all have a dime in their pocket at that moment, it immediately makes the topic much more relatable, which helps with their understanding. So the next element that I always recommend when you're giving presentations, but not necessarily even if you're not, but when you're giving presentations, is to be visual. Now, by that I mean that you want to think visually. You want to think about how can I create an image in people's minds. The reason I say think of it that way, because it means that even if you don't have a PowerPoint presentation, you can still think about talking in a way that's going to create vivid images in people's minds. Now, unusually for trials, actually, in this instance, they had set up kind of videos and PowerPoints so that Dr. Tobin could actually use the assistance of visuals in delivering his evidence. But not all visuals are the same. And so many times you will see slides and PowerPoint presentations that are just packed full of information that haven't been worked out in a way that makes it easy to understand. And I want you to pay attention to the way in which Dr. Tobin does his visuals, because he could have used graphs and charts. To an extent, he actually does in a little part of his evidence. But what he does is he thinks not in terms of how can I do a PowerPoint that is impressive for me, but how can I make a visual that makes it easy for my audience, in this case the jury, to understand what I'm talking about. So let's see a couple of the visuals that he actually uses.
Okay, so now we're looking, and you can see the contraction of the diaphragm. That's the kind of pink area down at the bottom. We see air going down through the windpipe and then proceeding down to the bronchial tubes. And then it was going to continue down the bronchial tubes until it will reach out to the air sacs, which will be the alveoli. And now we're seeing that we're moving down here, and these are like the grape-like structures down at the bottom, and this is where all the action occurs. The oxygen goes across those air sacs, and also the CO2 goes across them, then it's expelled back out.
So a really straightforward visual, right? And it just gave us what we probably already do know generally, but it really just gave it to us with the science behind it of how we actually breathe. Now that of course is going to be important as the evidence kind of goes on, because it's really about how it is that George Floyd's breathing was constricted by the police officers. But what he's doing here is just giving us a very easy visual that helps us kind of get a baseline of what we need to all understand about the process of breathing. And then he goes on. Now here, and this is where I have to say I found it a little bit hard, is he's thought about how can I demonstrate the impact that the pinning of George Floyd on the ground by the police officers actually had on his breathing. Many ways he could have done this. He could just have given his evidence and talked about it. But again, he really thinks about how can I bring this alive for the audience? And so he creates a graphic, a kind of a video graphic that is very graphic, but it perfectly sets out really the moment that really led to the death of George Floyd. And he does it by thinking visually for how can I present this in a way the audience is going to get. So watch in particular how he's made sure that the graphic designer has removed everything else, because fundamentally all the other things that were going on the day are irrelevant to the question of how was George Floyd pinned to the ground. And he also removes the police car, so that that view is not obstructing us, even though, of course, the police car was actually there in real life. It's a very visual but very powerful graphic that really just helps us understand what was going on the day.
Now you can see the car is being rotated. You're able to see Officer Chauvin, you're able to see Officer King, and then Officer Lane down at his feet. You see underneath Mr. Floyd, and now the car is being rotated. Now the car has been removed. And so you're able to see how they're positioned at different points. In terms of with Officer Chauvin with his left knee on the neck, his right knee on Mr. Floyd's arm and chest. And then you can see here Officer Lane holding his legs, and then you can see Officer King with his knee on his torso.
Yeah, such a powerful graphic. So my point about speaking with authority is to really think visually. Think about how you can create an image in your audience's mind that will resonate with them, that will connect with them, that will help to expose and bring alive the point it is that you want to make. Now, it may not always be that you're trying to recreate a real life event, as Dr. Tobin is here, but it is important for you to think in those terms, because very often it means that you can prepare and create a graphic or create visuals that are more than just lines on a chart, and that actually illuminate the subject that you want to speak about. Now, my next tip is to make sure that you are precise. Now, the reason that's important is not so that you get lost in unnecessary precision, but you signify to your audience that you are an authority and you are an expert, and experts are precise in their subject. They are precise about their wording, their terminology, their calculations, whatever the area is. So it is important that you, as well as simplifying things so that people can understand it, you make sure that you aren't imprecise, which would then give a misleading or inaccurate information to your audience.
Did you consider where Mr. Chauvin's left knee was during the encounter?
Yes, for Officer Chauvin's left knee is virtually on the neck for the vast majority of the time.
And when you say vast majority, are you able to be more
It's
specific?
more than 90% of the time in my calculations. There's certain times where it becomes difficult because you don't get a good view of where it is. So for example, I know that an Officer Chauvin's right knee is on his back 57% of the time. The reason I'm not able to say for the 43% is that I don't get a good view. I can, other times, don't have a good view of exactly where it is.
Yeah, so good example of him just being precise. And as I said, you don't want to get lost in detail because that will often lose your audience, but you do want to show that you are precise so that they trust you as an expert. So the next skill that Dr. Tobin uses in his kind of repertoire of techniques for bringing the audience along with them, and this is the one that actually I think is probably the most effective in a way, is he makes them move. Now, when you are trying to impart information to people, it's actually very important to remember that there are basically three types of learners. There are those that learn from listening, those that learn from seeing, that's the people who are visual learners, but there's also those that learn from doing and acting. That's kind of kinesthetic learning. And Dr. Tobin does this very, very effectively, actually in two moments. I'm going to show you the first one, and then I'll separate that and then show you the next one. So let's watch this first one.
To understand the knee on the neck, you need to examine your own necks, all of you here in the jury, like I'm doing now. And so, I mean, the first thing is if you put your index and thumb up here at the top of your neck, the first big thing you're going to find is your Adam's apple. And you can find the Adam's apple, and it's a very sturdy structure because it's surrounded by cartilage, and it protects the voice box, the larynx, which is essential to for speech. And so any amount of compression on the Adam's apple is not going to compress it. This is an extremely strong, sturdy structure. It's not going to be compressed by a knee on the neck. Then you go down from your Adam's apple and you feel the little bumps beneath that. And these are the rings of cartilage of your trachea, or your trachea. So this is your windpipe here. And so that's, again, because of the cartilage there, a knee on the front of that part is not going to cause compression, okay? But then bring your finger up to the top of your Adam's apple. And up at the top of your Adam's apple, you're now directly over the hypopharynx. And the hypopharynx is the crucial area in Mr. Floyd. So this here is where the hypopharynx is located on your surface anatomy.
Now, the interesting thing is that at this particular moment in the trial, I wasn't actually watching. I was listening to it on the car radio, just on my way to dropping my son at his weekly capoeira class, but I had this on in the background. And even though I was only listening, so not watching, I actually found myself, as I was driving, kind of feeling for my voice box in the way that he was describing. And that's very, very kind of very, very smart from him. And if you noticed, he actually said to the jury, all you members of the jury, you should do this. And the reporting on the day is that all of the members of the jury were actually doing as he asked them. They were fiddling around their necks and trying to work out where their voice box was, their trachea and all of that. And that was very effective because it means that he had the entire jury with him. And because he was giving them something to do, something kinesthetic, that really, really also helped them to get and kind of really, really take in what he was saying. There is a great quote by the Chinese philosopher Confucius, who said, "I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand." And that really was sending the message that the more interactive you make a piece of learning, the more you get people physically involved in whatever it is you're trying to tell them or teach them, the more likely they are going to really get what it is you are trying to share. And the proof of how effective that was as a technique actually comes in the next section, the next time that he again asked the audience, the jury rather, to physically do the things that he wanted them to do. Let's watch.
And now, if you put your hand at the back of your neck, and you feel the bottom of your skull, and so where the bone of the skull ends, and then you come down from that, and you'll find, and you put your whole palm of your hand around it. Sorry?
So here what's actually happened is that the defense lawyer has asked for a sidebar, so essentially made a representation to the judge that this shouldn't be allowed, that the witness, Dr. Tobin, shouldn't be telling the jury members that they should be doing these things, i.e. fiddling around with their necks and so forth. And you'll actually see in a second that the judge comes back and gives the jury members an instruction.
Members of the jury, the witness has asked you to do certain things. These are not required. You may do them, and he should phrase it more in terms of if you were to do that. And if you wish to do it, that is your choice. You are not required to do anything that the witness instructs you to do, but feel free to do it if you wish. Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Tobin, if we could go back to where you're explaining the anatomy and the back of the base of the skull.
Yep. So as I'm putting my hand here at the back of my neck, and I'm feeling the tip of my skull, and then I'm bringing down my hand, I'm feeling an extremely thick ligament, and that's called the nuchal ligament. And it's almost, as I put the full palm of my hand on my nuchal ligament, it's almost like wood. It's so strong a ligament. And that ligament is what you're seeing. The knee is being placed over on the left-hand side.
And of course, although the judge gave the jury members that instruction, the reporting on the day is that all of the jury still did the actions that Dr. Tobin was asking them to do, to fiddle around with their necks, to kind of work out where things were. And that is because when you are trying to get people to really truly understand what it is you are trying to get them to understand, it's a very effective way if you can actually get them to do something that will help them physically get involved in the information that you are trying to share. Very, very effective from Dr. Tobin. The other part of that was also impressive and good, rather, is the way that he loosened his tie and then got into the action. The reason that was good is because what it was basically signaling to the audience is, yes, I'm here in a formal suit and tie, as you would expect of me as an expert, but I'm not going to let that formality get in the way of the information that I want you to understand. So by loosening his tie, he's signaling to the audience that, yeah, I'm breaking those barriers because I really want you to understand the information that I'm trying to give. And then, of course, he puts his tie and his button back on. That signifies that I'm still a professional, but I'm willing to break the rules if that's what it takes to get the information across. And the final element of Dr. Tobin's evidence that I also found impressive was another aspect of being able to speak with authority, which is a quiet certainty. Now, by this I mean that, as you can hear from his evidence, Dr. Tobin was very mild-mannered in his words and in the way he delivered them. There was very much a certainty about it that wasn't shouty or preachy or kind of demanding attention. It was simply, I am an expert and I'm giving you the information that I want to give you. And this was probably best demonstrated actually when he was being cross-examined by Derek Chauvin's lawyer, when the lawyer was trying to put something to him effectively about blood and airways, and trying to get Dr. Tobin to agree with him. And Dr. Tobin was kind of clear that, yes, I'm going to agree with you where you are right, but where I think you are wrong, I will let you know it. But he does it in a very mild-mannered way, nevertheless still being clear and firm in his points, that actually slightly destabilizes the lawyer, and you'll kind of hear the lawyer lose his words a little bit. And then Dr. Tobin kind of comes out on top of that exchange with a little bit of humor as well. Let's watch.
But again, in terms of what we have learned about Mr. Floyd from his autopsy and his medical records, is that we understand that Mr. Floyd had some heart disease, right?
That is correct.
In fact, I believe that he had in some of his arteries somewhere between a 75 and 90% occlusion of his ventricular arteries, right?
Correct.
And that's going to affect blood flow in a person, right? It's going to make the body work a little harder to get the blood through the body.
No, not really. It's not going to do that.
Okay. How does that affect a person's respiratory?
The coronary artery?
Mm-hmm.
If the coronary artery is affecting it, and if the coronary artery was contributing to shortness of breath, you would expect that he would be complaining of chest pain, and you would expect that he would be demonstrating a very rapid respiratory rate. We don't see either.
Okay. And we'll come back to the respiration. I can't say it right. I'm taken by your accent. The respiratory rate.
I can't compensate for it.
Appreciate it. I'll say it like you, his respiratory rate.
Okay. There you go.
All right.
So you could see from that exchange that Dr. Tobin didn't get aggressive or angry or kind of refute the lawyer's words by saying, you're not the expert, I'm the expert. He just maintained a quiet certainty. And what that does is it signals to the jury, or if it's you, to your audience, that this really is somebody who is comfortable and confident in the knowledge that they have, because they don't need to shout about it. They just know it. They have an innate belief. That quiet certainty is going to be one of the strongest elements to give you that ability to speak and command with authority whenever you have to communicate. So there we are. There are some of the qualities and skills that Dr. Tobin brought to bear in his evidence at the trial of Derek Chauvin. The trial continues as at the time I'm recording this, so who knows what will happen. But it was quite instructive actually that a number of the other experts that gave evidence referred to the evidence of Dr. Tobin saying, well, of course, I'm not a pulmonologist. You really need to listen to him. And I think that is because he really, really did show us how to speak with expert authority and gave us a lot of things that we can all learn from. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Of course, this is just snippets of stuff that you can use to help improve your communication skills. If you want to take it that step further, I have a great free workshop that you will find at greatspeech.co/workshop. on the 5 communication super skills that will change your career if you use them, stall your career if you don't. It's had a lot of really great reviews actually, so definitely one to check out. I will see you guys on the next video.